Hey, I'm Alex Mackel from Board Game Co., and today I'm talking about why I care about value in crowdfunding. This is a video that you're either watching because it showed up in your subscription feed, perhaps I replied to a comment with this video, or maybe you saw it because I've talked about it or linked about it in my to back or not to back series, which I'll probably start doing going forward. This is a video about why I care about value in crowdfunding. If you've been watching my channel for years, or possibly for 2 days, or who knows how long, you may have noticed that in my to back or not to back series, I often talk about whether games hold their value. To back or not to back, it's a series I do every single Monday, or most Mondays. I go over crowdfunding, I talk about the campaigns, I talk about the games, the pledge levels, the stretch goals, all of that, and then somewhere along the way, I talk about, does it hold its value? Does it make sense to get it now, to wait for retail? If you do get it now, will you get your money back if you don't, if you sell it, if it's not for you? I talk about all those things. And a lot of people, I would argue most people who watch my channel, know my general 2 cents on this already. I did a video on this way back, the first 6 months of ever covering crowdfunding. I did a video, I'll link to it down below in case you want to see the disparity of old Alex and new Alex. I mean, it's not that, it's whatever. If you want to see the disparity between the two videos, so I'll link to that down below. But I figure it's 5 years now, it's been 4 years since that video, something like that. I don't know the exact time frame. It's time for an updated version, which is not really going to be anything new. It's going to be the same things said again, possibly with a new twist or spin on it, but the same basic messaging is going to be the same. And again, many of you already know this. But I have to put out a video like this once in a while because there are many who don't. There are many who watch a video and they're like, why is this guy talking about the value of board games? Why are you focusing on whether a game will hold its value? Aren't you just in this hobby for fun like the rest of us? Why is this the thing you're focusing on? It's a terrible way to make money. It's a terrible way to focus on things. Why are you doing this? And I think it's a great question, which is why every once in a while, I think it's good for me to answer it. And today's video is answering that question to give framework or a paradigm shift to those who think I'm just covering crowdfunding and I just care about the value of board games. Because I'm going to go on a bit of a journey, a bit of a story about my own pathway in this hobby and where I started, how I am where I am. A bit of a condensed version, not every single detail, but focusing on the value aspects of things, of where and how I got to be the way I focus on things. But before I go down that rabbit hole of the story and then the reasons, I want to be very clear about one thing, just out the gate. I don't think board games are a great way to make money. I don't think you should be buying board games because, hey, it'll hold its value and then you can turn around and sell it having never tabled it, never played it, and it's just about trying to make money. I think there are easier, safer ways to make money. If you are watching my channel looking for advice on how to make money by backing crowdfunding projects and then turning around and selling them later, I think it's a terrible use of your time, an absolutely terrible use of time. If you've done it, kudos to you. I do think it is doable. I'm not saying it's not doable, I just think there are much easier ways to make money. Even just focusing on trading cards, just buy Magic the Gathering booster boxes of Pokemon, you already have a better safety rate or rate of return and all that. Board games are not the best way to make money in terms of backing crowdfunding and selling it later. The reason I talk about value, and again I'm going to go into a short notes and then story and then longer conversation. The reason I talk about value is because I do believe in trying to play as many games as possible and doing so while on a limited budget. And if you do focus on whether a game you're spending money on, whether it holds its value, if you do focus on that, you can turn around, buy a game, play the game, sell it for most or all of what you paid for it, and then try the next game. If you do this process right, you can play much more games on a lower rate of return in terms of your dollar by playing as many games as possible. For me, holding its value is about being able to enjoy the hobby. It's not about just trying to make money on board games. But with that kind of cliff notes out of the way, for those who won't make their way 20 minutes into this video, because many of you won't, and I get that, let's go ahead and just start with myself, my journey, and all of that. I was always the kid who sold things when I was growing up. I was always the kid who focused on buying and selling and different things, and so I already started off by having that kind of mental framework. I was somebody who ran lemonade stands, who'd buy packs of Hershey's Nuggets at the store and then go to school and sell them for 25 cents a pop, making $2 per bag, which when you're in 4th grade is not a small amount of money. And so I was always that type of personality in general. And when I started diving into any hobby I ever had, I always tried to find ways to minimize the cost of that hobby. The most classic version for me is Steam. As much as I love Steam, the video game platform, there's a downside to Steam, which is when you buy a game on Steam, often on these very deep discounted days, which again, that's the upside, but you can't really turn around and sell a game you already bought. Well, already played. You could sell Steam keys, that's a different story, but you can't really sell a game that you already played. And growing up, I often did buy video games, whether it was Xbox or Steam or whatever, PC, Xbox, whatever it was. I would buy the physical video games, I would play them, and I would turn around and sell them. That was a very common thing I did because, again, if you're operating on a limited budget, if you want the financial ability to do what you want, and make no mistake, my family was always middle income-ish, meaning I never felt in any sense of threat of starvation or being evicted or any of those kinds of things. And there are people who grow up like that, and that's a horrible thing to go through. I never felt any of that. But I also never felt that money was just around. I never felt that things could just be bought. Or I was never a kid who just got stuff. I never had an allowance. I had to make my own money and spend my own money to enjoy life. I bought my own computer when I was like, I don't know, I don't remember how old it was, but I bought my own computer. I want to say maybe 10th grade, 11th grade, I don't know. But like I worked summers, I bought my own computer, built my own system. I've always been able to make my own money and spend my own money, but that meant that there always started off with a degree of financial awareness around where my money was coming from and where it was going. It's easier to spend money you didn't spend time earning. It's easier to be not mindful of what something costs and what that turnover and what that value of enjoyment is when you have more money and more ability to spend it. It's harder when you want shiny new things and you're trying to figure out how to do so on a limited budget. And so I used to go on eBay and buy used games and then turn around and sell those used games on eBay, often losing the cost of shipping. I'd have a video game that I had for 5 months and I'd only spent $4 on the whole thing because I lost the shipping cost, but everything else I bought on eBay, sold on eBay, lost the fees. Maybe I paid $5 for a video game. It was cheaper than renting, not that renting was that prevalent an option at the time, and I got to experience those games for a longer amount of time. I've always cared about the ability to turn around and take something you love and have easier access to it. This also happened when I got into Magic the Gathering. I don't remember exactly when that happened. I want to say it was, I don't know exactly when I got into Magic the Gathering. I'm trying to remember now. Was it like, which years it was? I want to say it was in 2006, 2007, somewhere around then I got into Magic the Gathering. And I fell heavily down that rabbit hole for 3-4 years. I was very deep into it, but for a reasonable amount of time, didn't get too crazy into it. But the same kind of situation happened. I got into Magic, started spending money on Magic the Gathering collections, again on eBay, buying used, enjoying them, having that access to cheaper cards, focusing first on just building out decks for the fun of it. I built out decks in Lorwyn or whatnot, just building a full cat themed deck or elf themed deck. I wasn't worried about mechanics so much as I was about theme, at least at first. But then as you start getting better at the game, as you start understanding the systems more, you start wanting those more expensive cards, and the cards do get more expensive. And so I ended up starting to sell Magic the Gathering too. I started not just buying it for myself, but buying it, turn around, sell it. And I had that aspect where I started turning around and buying for myself at first, selling for myself, but then buying just for the sake of selling and turned it into our own little side hobby. But again, it started off with the ability, with the mindset of how can I spend less money on this game? How can I churn the things I've already bought and get something back for it to be able to buy that next set without shelling out $80 a booster box at a full complete loss? And so that was Magic the Gathering, which lasted a few years. A few years is relative. I mean, the whole hobby thing lasted maybe 6 years, something like that. But like, it was heavily into it for a few years. Did it as a business for a bit. Eventually, shut out as I closed it down and stopped doing it. Maybe it was 4 years, start to finish. I don't remember exactly. But then again, in 2011, I got into board games, and the same thing happened. I wanted every board game. And now I was a bit more of an adult now. I had a bit more of an income, but I wasn't in a great place. When I first moved to the US, when I first got married, I was making maybe $24,000 a year. I don't remember what it was exactly, but it was not a lot. I remember my first job, I was making $11 an hour, and I got a bump to $11.50 an hour, and I was like, whew, that puts a bit of an ease on the finances. Eventually, I did work my way up, but I don't remember exactly when I got into board games. I might have been making $30K a year when I got into board games. So again, a little bit more disposable income, but also a kid at that point. And so I was able to start spending money on board games, but there was still mindfulness around my income versus my spending and what I could do to justify the continued spending on board games, because I did want to continuously buy board games. I got to a point where I had bought somewhere in the range of 400 board games, almost all of them used, very rarely new. I would buy used, I'd buy ding and dent. I was always trying to find ways to buy board games at the most economical way possible. And eventually, there was a great way to get myself into the hobby and to get myself into these board games. But regardless of how cheaply I was getting the games, one day I woke up and I had 400 games and I had only played around 100, 150 of them. And I was like, this is not tenable. And so I decided to start looking into selling those games. And I did. I started selling those games. I started trading those games first. I started trading them. That's what I did first. I started turning around and trading those games to be able to trade them into other games, but focusing specifically on trading up. That's how Board Game Co., the original inspiration for this channel, Board Game Co., that started because I started trading games. And I started trading games, I got more games, I started selling games, and I really started to manage to turn around and turn games into others. But the trading started off as a way for me to go ahead and get things economically. From those 150 games I played, I would regularly play a game, and if I liked it, it goes into my shelf. If I didn't like it, I turned around and traded that game away, again trying to find a way to turn something I had already purchased into something that I could now get for less. The cost of shipping was now a factor, as opposed to just, paying entirely for a new game. And that's why Board Game Co. very much started as, trading a few games, then trading lots of games, because if you can trade 5 games at once, the cost of shipping per game goes down to $4 per game as opposed to $11 per game. And so you had all these ways of making it more economical. And that's always been my goal, being more economical while enjoying the hobby. And enjoying the hobby is a huge part of it. I play more games than most people I know. And I play more games than, well, I guess it depends on who you are, because most people I know is a lot of non-gamers too. I play a lot of games. I go through a lot of games. I get to experience and try a lot of games. That's always been the case before I ever started reviewing games, and it's even more so now, but I like experiencing what's out there. And to me, it was always the ability to try to find ways to economically spend the money I wanted, enjoy the things I wanted, and turn them into more of the thing I wanted, as opposed to just buying that thing. 82% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. The number does fluctuate, but at least one article I pulled up said 82% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And the way I've talked about this in the past, but that does not mean that 82% of Americans are lucky enough to make exactly what they need to survive, no more, no less. That's not what that means. That means that people on average manage to spend what they make. People on average manage to fluctuate or adjust their spending around what they make. A little more money, maybe you eat out a few times more that month. Maybe you have 4, media subscriptions as opposed to 1. You get a little less money, things get tight, you have that car payment, you find ways to cut things back. If over the course of let's call it a 5-year period, you have not gone further into debt and you have not made more money, you put money into savings. If neither of those things are true, if you have not put more money into savings, you have not gone further into debt, you are either incredibly lucky and fortunate to have had exactly the amount of money you need come in over a 5-year period, or you've spent what you made. You found ways to adjust, to fluctuate. And it's not a criticism. That is the way so many people are brought up. I was fortunate enough to be brought up in a way that while I didn't have a rich household by any means, I did have access. Specifically, my mother was a big fan and proponent of buying me all these books that talked about investing and money and credit card debt and, percentage of interest paid on credit card debt. There are insane numbers out there that we really, as a society, some people are not educated on just how much you can end up spending if you're not careful, but how to try to prioritize and save your money and be economical with that money. I believe in spending money. I do. Lord knows I spend money on things, but I believe in doing so with intent. I believe in doing so with the intent around the value that thing will give me and how I can make the most out of it and the cheapest way to go ahead and get it. Something that blows my mind sometimes when I think of mortgages is this would be an entire conversation around financial awareness, which is where it's pivoting to a degree. With mortgages, a fascinating thing when you're buying a house is some people will sit there and price shop for a toaster. They'll go on Amazon, they find that $40 toaster, they'll see if they can get the same one with a better rating of $36, and they save $4, they put 15 minutes of research into it. Some people will do that. Some people won't. Some people will just buy the first toaster. But some people will try to save money on a toaster or a TV or whatever it is. But they won't price shop for mortgage interest rates. If you're not calling at least 2 lenders when you're getting a mortgage, you're risking paying way more than you should because you're not at least comparing. You're not at least trying to get, options on the table. The difference between a 6.75% interest and a 6.85% interest can be thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars over the life of a loan. It is an intense amount of money. You just need to plug it into mortgage calculators. The idea of how much you can spend by paying an extra $100 on your mortgage every single month. There's so much stuff. We'll do financial awareness a whole other time. It'll be a lot of these same notes. But it means that I've always been money conscious about how to get the most out of things. Which is where, when I got into the hobby, when I found the love for board games, I went on that journey. I figured out how to trade games that I had already purchased. I bought games on the cheap. I traded those games for other games. Those are great ways for me to enjoy the hobby while being able to buy things in the hobby. Crowdfunding represented a new challenge for me. When I first started falling down the crowdfunding rabbit hole, which started with Cthulhu Death May Die. I had backed crowdfunding campaigns before then, but Cthulhu Death May Die was when I really started to fall down that rabbit hole. It's when I really started to spend a lot on crowdfunding. Not just the occasional crowdfunding campaign every year and a half, 2 years, but to just actively be looking for crowdfunding campaigns that I wanted to own. And I fell down that rabbit hole and I saw these $100 games, these $200 games. It's since ballooned to the point now where at $500 games and more, but I wanted it all. I wanted it all, and but how? How can you spend that much money on a limited income? How could you spend that much money when you've only ever bought games, not only ever, when you've primarily bought games either on sale or used or ding and dent, when you've always tried to find ways to spend as economically as possible? How can you justify a hobby where you're now spending $150 on average per game? How can you justify that when your whole entire mindset is one of saving and bang for your buck? Why should I buy a $100 game when a $40 game will give me the same enjoyment? And by the way, that's a good question. For anyone who's operating with tight finances, especially if you have the money and you want to live your life, by all means. There are many ways in which I let go of any reasonable common sense in order to enjoy this hobby. We'll talk about that too. But if you have the finances to do so healthily, do what you want. But if you are operating with a tighter degree of income, you should not buy a $100 game when a $40 game will give you the same enjoyment. You shouldn't. It's a weird concept, but why would you do that? Now, if you already have all the $40 games you want and the $100, whatever, the steps. But if you're looking at two purchases right now and you want them both and one's much cheaper and they're not differently rated and they're not different in the level of interest, buy the cheaper game. So how can I justify this new pivot into crowdfunding? Because I was very much addicted to games. I was not addicted to money, I was addicted to games. But I had to still justify doing so economically. And that's where I started to realize there were games on crowdfunding that held their value, and there were games that didn't. You see, I've always churned through games. I've always played so many new games, and then some percentage of them stay in my collection, but most don't. Most games can't. When you play a lot of new games every single year, you can't have most of them entering their collection. This has always been true for me. I've always wanted to try and play as many games as possible, and so I've always had many of those games not sticking around, and paying $150 for a game that doesn't stick around is a problem. Unless you realize which $150 games you can turn around and get your money back on. Because then you're not actually spending money, you're just lending the money. The money goes away temporarily, you get most of it back. In some cases you actually make money, in some cases you lose a little bit on shipping and fees and whatnot. But if you can find ways to turn around and sell the games that you spent money on, if you can find ways, like there are so many times, so many instances over the years. I remember Borrowed Song is a particular one. Borrowed Song was a game I wasn't sold on. It's from Steamforged Games. I like the company overall, but their games some have really worked for me. I love some of the games and some not so much. Borrowed Song was one where I wasn't sure. I talked about it in a full video. I was like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and jump into this game because I've seen enough that I'm intrigued by it, and if I'm wrong, it will hold its value. I gave myself that mental permission to spend the money on the game, which was not cheap, to back the game, and then to try it out, knowing if it wasn't for me, it would hold its value. Which it did. I turned around and sold Borrowed Song. I made $150 on the game. Granted, since then the market on Borrowed Song has gone down. It took time, but the market crashed, and so it's no longer the same. But I tried it. I gave it 15 hours. I reviewed it, and then I moved on from it, and I made money on that purchase. But it's a purchase I would never have made if I wasn't focusing on whether a game doesn't hold its value. It's a game I wouldn't have been able to try. A game I was interested in, wanted to try. It looked cool, but I wasn't sold on whether it would be for me or not, and I gave myself that permission. Being in the crowdfunding space pivoted how I had to approach being able to experiment and try with different games, to be able to play as many games as possible, back as many games as possible, enjoy as many games as possible, but doing so without breaking the bank. That is the entire focus of when I talk about whether a game holds its value. My entire focus is how can we enjoy games without putting ourselves into negative financial situations? How can we either enjoy games without putting ourselves on a tight spot, or alternatively buy those games in the first place when you otherwise wouldn't. I have a freedom to buy or back things that I wouldn't have if I didn't focus on, will this game get my money back? And that's why if you watch my videos, if you watch any of the videos, you'll see that there are games where I talk about, oh my gosh, like this one you might lose $10 on. You might get most of it back, and that's just a decision. It's just knowledge and information for you to build a decision around. Knowing that some games have a chance of even making you money, well, if you're in any way interested in those games, by all means do so. You may even make money back on this one. You may make $50 because it's exclusives, this company has a good reputation. Some companies have that aspect where you'll make money on the game. Alternatively, sometimes there's cases where you'll lose a little bit. Like, hey, this game historically, if you look at this company's games, generally the crowdfunding games, they sell for, you get back your money, but you lose the $15 shipping and whatnot. And that's, again, it's just information that you can make a purchase around. If I turn around, if I sell this in the secondhand market, if I try this game, because many of us, myself included, many of us are fine spending the money on things that we're going to keep and enjoy. It's just so much harder when you don't. It's so much harder when you get the game, you play it 3 times, you're like, well, that was $100 for a game I don't want to play again. What do I do now? That's where this whole holding its value comes in. It's about giving you the financial freedom to buy something knowing what you stand to lose, knowing what you stand to risk, knowing that Euro game you just bought, I might lose $10 in it, but that's worth it Because crowdfunding is such an exciting journey sometimes. It's a little crazy, but sometimes it's an exciting journey where you get to back the game. You get to go ahead and see all the updates, the stretch goals, the reveals. You get to go ahead and get those updates of production and these teases and now it's starting to ship and you're on this journey and it shows up and you unbox it and you play it. And before you've ever touched the game, before you've ever played the game, you've already had enjoyment along the way. There's a reason I fell in love with the magic of crowdfunding. There's a reason I still believe in the magic of crowdfunding. There is something fun about it before you even ever play the game. But then you play the game, and that's where things go in two directions. Sometimes you play the game, you're like, this is everything I've been waiting for. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I waited for this game. It's so great. It's so amazing. I'm so excited. I'm glad it's here. I will probably back 4 games this week, but this one, at least right now, I'm enjoying and I'm happy I got. Alternatively, you end up in the case where you're like, well, it was a nice journey, but this game's not for me. That other game does it better. That game that I got in between from retail, this game that landed at retail that I got before, after I backed this game, before I got this game, I tried another game that does this better. You have whatever the reason is. Sometimes you play the game and it just isn't for you. Whether it's a horrific failure, whether it's a terrible game, whether it's just okay, sometimes you just don't, you're not impressed anymore. But now you spent $100, $200, sometimes $300 or more on this game that doesn't impress you, and now what do? You could gift it to a friend. There's nothing wrong with that. There's something nice about that for sure. You can gift it to a library. Libraries start taking games. There's programs around that. But, like, honestly, I don't know if libraries need the $300 games. They often probably need the cheaper games in general. Like, a giant copy of Oath one with 4 boxes is not doing the library any favors, I imagine. Or you can turn around and try to sell that game. You can try to turn around and turn that game not into money, but in potential future enjoyment for the hobby. That's why I talk about games holding as a value. That's why I care about whether a game makes sense to buy it now or makes sense to buy it later. It never has and never will be about buying a game to make money. I think in mind, I'm pretty sure I have to go through everything, but I'm 99% certain that in every single game I've ever backed in the past 7 years of being involved in crowdfunding, I don't think I've once backed a game with the intent to sell. I could be wrong. I'd have to go through and find if I ever did, but I do not think I've ever backed a game with the intent to sell. I have only ever backed games with the intent to play, but then the fallback, the ability to know whether if that game doesn't work for me, can I turn it into money for the next game? It's been a long time since I've been tracking my crowdfunding purchases. I used to, before I started doing media, even the first year or two of doing YouTube, I tracked all my crowdfunding purchases. I tracked everything I spent, from the shipping, from the initial money, I tracked it all, and then I tracked what I got back for those games, whether it was other games or whether it was money, I tracked it all. And I was net positive on money. The amount of money I spent on crowdfunding. There were games I lost money on, but there were games I made money on, and far more I got games that I made money on. And that meant that I was able to experience this hobby. I was able to enjoy everything I was doing, and I was able to do all of that while being at a net positive, which means I had the financial freedom to play board games. That's what this is about. That's what this has always been about. It's been about the ability to play more board games. It's been about the ability to fall in love with the hobby without breaking your wallet, without breaking the bank. It's always been about that. And that's not for everyone. And that's okay too. Because there's work involved in this. There's work involved in trying to track when a game will or won't hold its value. There's work involved in the selling of a game when it shows up. There's work and labor and effort involved, and there's nothing wrong if this is not an element of the hobby that doesn't work for you. There's nothing wrong if you just don't care about whether a game holds its value. And that doesn't mean you have to be financially well off too. Whatever situation you're in, whatever you're doing that's right for you is totally fine. Keep doing what's right for you. But also understand that there are people who do care about this stuff. There are people who are making these decisions. When my channel first started, the thing that made my channel took off is, for a while, I just started talking about videos in general. I started talking about board games in general. But then at a certain point, I started talking about crowdfunding. And I started talking specifically about how and why I backed games. I would cover a crowdfunding campaign talking about, for me, without intentionally trying to focus on it, I'd just be like, oh, I'm getting this or not because it does or doesn't hold this value. I would have those conversations without realizing that there was a large segment of the board game population that latched onto that because no one else was talking about it. I didn't do so with intent. I was just trying to talk about my own experiences through the lens that I see the board game space, the lens that I've seen any hobby that I'm in, where I want to enjoy it, but I want to do so responsibly and economically and have as much access with as little pain as possible. And a lot of people latched onto that. A lot of people saw value in those conversations. And right now, my channel has been very, very fortunate. I'm very grateful for all of you. I've been able to grow in the YouTube space. And that means that I've grown past that initial bubble of people who were there for a specific reason. There are still many people who watch my videos hoping to get that insight as to whether this game is or isn't likely to hold this value based on the game itself, based on the company's past games, based on the current marketplace. Crowdfunding in general has shifted, and games hold their value a little less than they did like 7 years ago when I first started doing this. But there are people who still want that information. There are people who watch my videos who don't care about that at all. And that's why every once in a while I get those questions like, why do you care about a game holding its value? Why aren't you just in this for the love of the game? And the only answer I have there is it's always been about the love of the game. It's just a way to experience the love of the game, a freedom to experience the love of the game. Again, I talked earlier about how I mentioned, like, there's games that are definitely not about whether it makes sense to get them. As much as I sit there and say you should never have that $100 game if that $40 game will do the job. I have Marvel United. I'm like $900 into Marvel United, into the United system between DC, Marvel, X-Men, whatever it is. The amount of money I spent on Marvel United, that it does not make sense. It does not make any sense, but it's a freedom that I've given myself because I'm in love with the hobby. There are sometimes ways you can't get away from spending money. You can make the choice. Do I want to be responsible? Do I want to be a responsible, mature adult who perfectly weighs up every single thing I do? Or sometimes I just want to love the hobby that I'm in, and I just want to own that thing that it does give me joy. And so my hobby, my way of approaching board games is absolutely and has always been divided up into both those things. I want to do as much as I can, and I will do things that don't always make sense. But I also want to be as responsible as I'm able to be while doing it. And if you find that kind of information useful, that's why the 2 back or not to back series that I put up every single Monday will likely always have some focus on value. I'll talk about the games, I'll talk about the publishers, I'll talk about the campaigns, the stretch goals, the add-ons. I'll mention the fact that you might get the game earlier. I'll mention the fact that sometimes you're supporting the publisher, and I'll mention the fact that sometimes it's just about FOMO that you can't otherwise get the game. But I'll also always tell you whether I think that game will or won't hold its value. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.